at the um, Ryerson website for something else entirely. And it just kind of clicked at that moment where I realized that publishing was where I was meant to be. I've always loved talking about books. I've always loved reading, of course, and it just kind of made sense. I did a couple of internships after my certificate was done. So I did one at HarperCollins, one at Tundra, which is one of the imprints I work with now, and one at Dundurn Press, which was totally different experience after coming from two of the big five and going into a very indie internship. And to be completely honest, I worked in retail for a couple of years before I actually landed my job at Tundra / Penguin Random House Canada Young Readers. I was hired as an associate publicist. I've been there for 5 years as of this September, and I love it. I've always loved kids' books. Like I said, I read young adult when I actually was a young adult, and then well after that as well. And it just made perfect sense to be able to talk about books for a living and share my love of reading and my love of books with other people.
That's amazing. I feel like we all have worked in retail at some point. Amy, can you tell us a little bit about how you got started?
Sure. I started in publishing, like, gosh, it's like I can't believe it's been like almost 20 years. Like that's incredible. I did an MA in English, and I kind of came to a realization that the only thing I've ever really been interested in is books. Like, really, I'm not interested in anything else. Like, in my entire life, like since I was 5, all I'm interested in is reading books. I mean, I don't get to do as much reading in my job as I would really like to do. Like, there's a lot of email. I started taking classes in Ryerson after I'd moved to Toronto, and I had a job with the provincial government here in Ontario. And Ryerson, I couldn't afford to do an internship because I was in my late 20s. I had, been a student for a while, and I needed to like work. So I started applying for jobs that were available through the Ryerson publishing program. Like they would collect these job ads and run them. And one of them was at a literary agency, and I applied and started there at the front desk. Worked there for a number of years, and then ended up at Transatlantic eventually because we're a virtual company and I had kids. So when I've always worked in agencies, which is a little weird for someone in this business. Most people move around more in terms of roles, but I've pretty much just worked in agencies, and I've been building a list ever since my youngest daughter went to kindergarten.
Wonderful.
Sorry, I think you said my name. You kind of cut out for me for a second.
Oh, so I was saying, can you tell us your story? How did you get started?
For sure. Yeah, I guess I'm probably the most recent addition to the publishing industry, having started spring of 2021. So I guess to go further back, yeah, I did a BA at University of Toronto, specializing in English, and also didn't really know what I wanted to do following that. I did take some courses in the same Ryerson program here and there, and then at the same time I've always been really into bookstores ever since I was a kid. I'd be like the kid who you just leave in the bookstore and then go off and do something else, and then come back and I'd still be there. So I ended up working, not really surprised that I ended up working at several bookstores, the world's biggest bookstore in Toronto, which doesn't exist anymore. And then the longest time would have been at Another Story Bookshop, which is like an independent bookstore here in Toronto in the West End. And so I worked there for about 7 years, sort of starting as a clerk, and then I ended up being the education support manager, which is basically like the wholesale manager, and ended up really falling in love with kids' books there because Another Story is it's a social justice oriented bookstore, but one of their main focuses is education in schools. So to work there for a while, you really get exposed to a lot of children's literature. So yeah, I ended up falling in love with it, and then ended up becoming the children's buyer. Sorry, this is a long journey. We're wrapping it up soon. To end, I guess, I ended up getting involved with Fold Kids, which is a literary festival in Brampton, Ontario, and because Another Story was one of their main booksellers, and I ended up doing a sort of a couple of speaking engagements with Fold, with the Fold Kids coordinator Ardo, and someone at ANIC, I guess, saw one of these speaking engagements, and that's how we kind of got connected. Ended up kind of speaking with them, with the editorial director, and eventually interviewed for a job there. And yeah, started part-time and now I'm full-time editing. So yes, this is the long and winding road to where I'm at now.
That's great. So I'm going to just stay with you, Khary, for a second, since you're the newest here. Can you tell us, what does an average day look like for you? And what, as an acquiring editor, what does that mean? What do you do?
It really varies. Like each day, the allotment of time on certain things varies. But I guess I'll start with the second part of your question first and then go to the average day. So as an acquiring editor, I basically am always on the lookout for manuscripts for, or even beyond that, just like potential interesting creators that ANIC might want to connect with. So that involves doing research, a lot of reading, and then research into certain writers or creators behind works that I encounter, getting into contact with them, sort of inquiring about whether they have an interest in writing for kids, if they're not a typical children's writer, or they're new to it, and then kind of just gauging whether they want to submit something, soliciting submissions basically. And on the other side of that is the submissions inbox, which at this moment I'm the person reading all of them that come in. So yeah, that involves basically looking through all the submissions emails, assessing whether they're something of interest to ANIC, replying to them, trying to keep on top of the very large flow of submissions. And then in addition to that, at the beginning of my time at ANIC, that was a lot of what I was doing, and then assisting with other editorial projects that were very interesting to me. So I was able to really get in there, and then now I'm on to the point where I'm building my own list and working on my own projects. So that's basically like the three main things that I end up doing. And so the other part of it is working on those titles. So whether it's doing like a substantive editing or any other part of the editing process for that title, and like I'm doing like all the coordination for those.
Oh, very cool. So Amy, I'm going to toss the same question to you, since what you guys do is some similarities, but also very different.
Yeah. Well, an agent's job is kind of like a blend of art and business. So it's it's 90% email. Like that's mostly what I'm doing in a day, like just sending emails. So I do submission. I try to do submissions every day, like domestic submissions to publishers in Canada and the US, sometimes the UK. I work on foreign submissions. I sell my clients' books internationally. So I have like, we have like agents in all corners of the world that I connect with and send information to about new books that I'm working on for clients representing. What else do I do? I talk to people about their books. I talk to clients about their books. I chase contracts. I spend a lot of time working on contracts, chasing contracts. I check clients' royalty statements. I go to a lot of Zoom meetings. So today I went to a meeting with the children's team, the other agents at Transatlantic who do children's books. And for a couple of hours, we have an agenda where we talk about all the issues that we're dealing with, talk about offers, deals, submissions, I help make catalogs, social media stuff. I feed stuff to our social media team to do deal announcements. It's kind of a endless. And then somewhere in there, usually on the weekends, I read submissions or I read manuscripts from clients, like new material from clients. I do some editorial work on my clients' books, depending on, I usually give kind of big picture notes. And then with things that are smaller, like, so I give big picture notes on novels, but I don't like copy edit anybody's novel, but I will like, I'll copy edit a book proposal, for example, to make sure that every comma is perfect. And sometimes I go to book fairs. Sometimes I go out for lunch with people. Like I went out for lunch with a client last week, which was something I hadn't done in a really long time, and it was super fun. And film and television. I do film and television submissions, to producers, and there's probably things I'm forgetting, but it's quite varied. It's very interesting, and what I do in a day can vary widely based on the time of year. But in every day, I try to have a chunk of time that's for contracts, a chunk of time for submissions, and then I go to my regular meetings and talk to clients and support them in their work, however I can and however I need to.
Great. And so Sam, from the marketing and publicity end, where do you come in and what's your day and role like?
Yeah, for sure. So I was, like I said, I was hired as an associate publicist. And then in the last year, I was promoted to senior associate of marketing and publicity just because my job changed a little bit over the last few years. So it just kind of made more sense to be marketing and publicity as a whole. So, I mean, publicists, of course, are the ones who get to do all that fun author talking. I actually see some of my authors in this chat today, which is always exciting because I never get to actually physically see my West Coast authors. So thanks, guys, for tuning in. But, I get to talk to them quite a bit about events and media and reviews and all that kind of fun stuff. Like Amy, I think there's a lot of emails involved, a lot of reaching out to people for all sorts of coverage, whether it's just an interview or a review or something else, working on a different campaign that I need people to help out with. I work a lot with influencers, Bookstagram and things like that. So that's always fun. I enjoy that part of it too. Marketing and publicity tends to be the last people who really touch a book. I mean, we see it sort of in its editing stages at some point, but we're the last ones to like physically touch it and, help get it into the world in a certain way. And so that's kind of exciting to be that person and work with authors and really build those relationships with both authors and media in general. Every time someone asks me what my day-to-day looks like, I just kind of draw a blank because it can change so quickly. Some days are very email heavy where it is just a lot of outreach and maybe not so many results, but just kind of getting the word out there. My favorite days are ones that I spend with authors, whether it's because we have an event at some point or just going around to indies or other bookstores for signings. I'm sure Khary, at some point we must have met when I brought an author to another story because I always made sure they were on the list since they're so great. But yeah, those are my favorite days, just hanging out with authors and getting to know them a little bit better while still doing my job. But it tends to be a lot of kind of waiting for things to happen and being able to share that good news when it does happen, if it's a great review or something like that. But sometimes it takes a while for anything to happen. So there's a lot of waiting in between.
So I'll throw this question out to all three of you all. What do you think, how do you think children's publishing has changed over, say, the past 10 years? I don't know who wants to speak first. I'll pick you, Amy. You can go first.
It's like, I think I'm the only one who's been here for 10 years, more than 10 years. Well, okay. One of the big things that's changed in, say, my time in publishing, so that can go back even more than 10 years, but there's a greater number of people writing children's books. So years ago, like when David Bennett, who was one of the founders of the agency that I work at, would go to the Bologna Book Fair, there would be the Bologna Book Fair that's the big children's book fair. It's in Italy every spring. And there's an agent center where the agents each have a table and meet with foreign editors, usually, mostly, right? And there was something like 30, 40 people in that book center, in the agent center in Bologna in in the late 90s. Now there are like over 200 tables of agents. So there's been since Harry Potter, there's been the attitude used to be there's no money in children's books. Now there's so the profile of children's books has raised in publishing overall. The money, there's more money to be made by authors in children's publishing. It was never until J.K. Rowling's series was such a big hit. There wasn't the advances were a lot lower. So there's been an increasing, I'd say, professionalization of children's writers. Illustrators, I think, have always been able to make a living to a certain extent because they tend to do children's illustration as well as other forms of illustration. But it never used to be possible to make a living as it's still very hard to make a living as a writer. It's always been hard to make a living as a writer, but it was never really possible for anyone to make their living as a children's writer. And that has changed. Still, it's the arts. There's not a lot of money in it. So I'd say that with that professionalization has come a lot more competition for writers. Competition for book deals. And then in the last 10 years, there's been a real explosion in terms of diversity in children's books, which has opened the doors to a lot more creators who were considered niche in the past. And now they're the most highly sought after creators out there. So that is the big diversity is the biggest thing pushing driving the children's market at this time. What else? I'd say that possibly the children's books have become maybe more fun. I think that's something that I would say, there's a real nobody really wants didactic books. They want children's books that are going to be fun, so you can learn something, but it's all hidden, or you kind of delight in the learning. So I think that that's a change. I think that there was 10 years ago, YA was was the thing. YA was really, really big in the market. It was, driven mainly by adult readers reading young adult books. So both domestically and internationally, YA was king, and now it's not. So it's harder to sell YA right now than it is to sell middle grade. So in novels, children's novels, middle grade, both domestically and internationally, is the most marketable form of children's novel. Young adult, children's novels. What else? Graphic novels. That's a big market trend. That's a big change in 10 years, where now every editor out there is looking to acquire, almost every editor is looking to acquire graphic novels. Again, they used to be niche. They used to be pushed off with the comic book, and now you have a professor of comics at UBC on this call, right? So this is that's a whole other that's a very interesting format that is a big change in the market, and just in the last, I'd say 2-3 years, internationally, children's publishers have started acquiring graphic novels and comics when they never used to. It used to be more of a North American thing, and now there's lots of except in France, and now there's lots of publishers looking for them all over the world. And what else? I guess the last thing I would say is that there's more opportunities now because for children's authors and all authors to have their books be developed in film and television because of the rise of Netflix and the other streamers. There's a lot more opportunities for people who have intellectual property like books. And the most in-demand form of IP for film and TV is book IP. So that's a change for creators more than the children's market, but it kind of feeds like the what's being streamed, what's being developed for film and television, then will like encourage book sales for those creators. So that's all I've got on that.
Sam or Khary, did you have any thoughts about changes you've seen since you've started in publishing or even before till now?
I think, oh, sorry. Are you going to go, Sam?
Oh, no, you could go ahead.
No, it was just to, I guess, echo a lot of the points that Amy brought up, like especially the piece around diversity or like a little bit of an opening of certain opportunities, especially given a lot of what I was looking for as a buyer at another story was very focused in that area, and because their whole thing is amplifying marginalized voices. So I would literally watch as like the amount of options like would increase. And then now that I'm on the other side, I also see the initiatives that certain publishers are taking to try and lower barriers that were there to begin with. I mean, obviously there's still a lot that could be done, but it seems like folks, especially post 2020, it seems that folks are taking steps to address that. So that is definitely heartening to see.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you, especially again, in terms of diversity and just the way what kind of books we see has changed so much in the last few years. From a marketing and publicity angle, one thing that I've noticed, even in the last 5 years that I've really been working, is a real shift away from like traditional reviews. So, I mean, you still have the big ones like Publishers Weekly and Kirkus and stuff like that. They're still pretty good at covering almost everything. Obviously, they can't cover everything, but they do a pretty good job of keeping up with what's big. But in terms of like newspapers and things like that, I think there's been a real shift away from it. There's just not enough space to talk about books in general in newspapers, and especially not kids' books. It tends to be the first thing to go, I think. So we do a lot more marketing and publicity in the online space, which I think is really interesting to watch. You have your bookstagrammers who've been around for a long time. You have your mommy bloggers who've been around for even longer than that. And then now we have TikTok, which I have very complicated feelings about TikTok, but it is a useful marketing tool. I think it does hit a certain audience, and we can see, when books take off on TikTok or platforms like that, then it takes off. Like the sales are bananas and you have no idea how to replicate that, but it's a really fascinating thing to watch, and a totally different now than it was 5 years ago, where, the most exciting thing for me would be to get like a Globe and Mail review. And now it's like, hey guys, guess what? We went viral. That's even more exciting than getting something in the newspapers. It's been really interesting to make that shift and see how we can kind of latch on to those changing trends and things like that.
Yeah. So Amy, I think you already started answering this question a little bit, so I'll give it to you and then we'll go over to Khary. But what are maybe the one or two biggest things that you look for when you're choosing a submission?
Well, I've got a whole list. Actually, I wrote a whole list. I don't have just one or two.
Okay, well, what's the whole list then? Yeah.
Okay, fantastic writing. Number one, fantastic writing. Like that is like the first thing, right? And I think that something that's very important in children's books in particular is voice. Like a voice that will speak directly to the child reader or the young reader. So voice is very important. And I like voicey things as a reader. I like voicey things in children's books. So that's that's a big one for me. I particularly like the combination of humor and heart, or lots of humor that's just silly, or something just heartfelt. But I like books that make me feel things. And so that's that. Those are things. Books that are not didactic. I don't like didactic things. And I don't think that they're very marketable either to like the kid. Like, even I don't think the kid in the library wants to pull a didactic book off the shelf. I think they want the fun book where the learning is kind of hidden in there. I like authenticity. So that means, in terms of like, we're talking about diverse voices and having more voices represented in children's books. I think like books that are written by people who have lived experience in whatever they're writing about. This isn't even really a new idea. Like I think that all agents know or would be able to tell you, and many editors would be able to tell you, that the best book that an author can write is kind of like the book of their heart, the book that is like reflective of their most authentic self. It's kind of those books tend to be the books that win the prizes, not the books that are just written for the market, although it's fine to write for the market, but the books with the authentic, genuine, heartfelt experience, I think are often the most successful. Books that are doing something new. So and that makes them marketable too. So when I'm marketing, I'm selling manuscripts to editors, and so I want to be able to read something where I can see like that there's like a hole in the market that this book will fill. So there's never been a book just like this one from this particular perspective, and we didn't see 15 books on the same topic come out last year that were all, really high profile. So will it stand out in the market? That's what I also think about. I think about who I can sell it to. Can I sell it to, am I going to have publishers really excited about this? Sometimes I don't care. Sometimes I just love something so much, I don't even care. Like, I just want to find a home for it. I want to find a happy home for the book. And I don't care if it's going to be sold at an auction or make a bunch of money. I just want the book to be in the world, and I want the author to have a home. I also look for format. So there are a lot of levels, all these, the students, the UBC students will know already, like there are different children's books levels, and does this manuscript fit one of those levels? Because not everyone knows the various formats. So you might have a really good idea, but it might not work for the level. And if it doesn't work for the level, then I can't sell it. So, and then Sam can't sell it.
Okay, on to you, Khary. What do you look for in submissions?
Amy did a very good comprehensive job. I feel like a lot of the things that you mentioned, especially voice, that's like the main thing that I was going to say. That similarly, that is my taste as well as a reader, but also, yes, to appeal to a younger reader, you really want to make that connection, and having a voice that feels like authentic and engaging and has a kind of, as you were saying, a unique perspective, is yeah, that kind of draws me in right away. What else? Right, and similarly, yes, there is like considerations around format. I think a lot of my work is more, there is some more room for development. So if it doesn't fit within like the specific ranges, usually I'll try to see, depending on what kind of relationship I'm able to establish with the creator, whether they're open to notes or anything like that, to try and see if they could resubmit in a different format if I'm in love enough with the idea and with the writing already. But yeah, fantastic writing. Those would be the main things. And yes, there's a lot of consideration of, especially like thinking about what I would look for as a buyer, uh, is considering, yeah, what is on the market now? Will this book, will this idea be able to stand up against what's out there already? Does it have something about it that could give it an advantage or make it stand out, or even is just like more interesting? Those are some things that I consider. Um, I do see your point about like the adaptive system, and I think in a lot of cases definitely prefer like something more that the emphasis is more on story or more on entertainment, or just like delight. I like that word a lot. But there is some consideration of like how things might play in a like an educational market, at least for ANIC, although our main focus is trade. So in certain areas, might consider that. But yeah, those are some of the main things I'm looking for when I'm looking at commissions.
So I feel like anytime there's a editor, publishing agent chat, this idea of voice and how important that is always comes up. Can anyone, like if you were to describe voice to someone who's not a writer, not in publishing, what would you say to them? Like, what is voice and what about it is what you're looking for particularly?
I mean, I didn't want to be you want to take this. To me, it is more like the sense of almost like a personality, or like a sense that you're being told a story from a particular perspective, and that certain like personality, or like almost like a charisma to a certain extent that comes through in the writing. I don't know, maybe some other folks have more a slightly different way of describing it, but that's usually how I envision it. But yeah, I know, and that's why it's so appealing, because it's something, as I'm sure your writing students can attest, is pretty difficult to achieve, or it can be tricky. It's not like a formulaic thing that you can just whip up. So when you see that, it's, at least for me, it means like I'm more willing to kind of like go with it and sort of see like that's something that is harder to kind of recommend a fix for than maybe like some problems in the narrative structure or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. Amy or Sam, did you want to chime in?
I just want to say, I think also with certain, like you want the voice in children's books also about like it's sounding like to the child reader, you want the child reader to recognize themselves, and to hear like often it's like something that sounds somewhat contemporary, even if it's historical. Like there has to be kind of ring of truth to the child protagonist if it's a novel voice. So one of my colleagues at work describes middle grade, for example, as a child speaking to another child with no adults in the room. And I think that's a good way of, describing it. And sometimes like problems I'll see with voice, like sometimes they're like, it's hard, yeah, you're right. It's hard to fix it, right? But sometimes I will say, you know what? This is not ringing. This is not sounding right to my ear. Do you know any teenagers? So like sometimes that can help. A lot of people will, instead of like doing the research for their for the work of researching what contemporary children sound like, if they don't have any in their lives, people who do a lot of author visits, a lot of school visits, they listen really carefully when they're in the school visit to try to hear. That's it's the authentic child voice, that, or a voice that will appeal to a child, even if it's a rabbit or something, or even if it's in space.
Okay, so what advice would you give to prospective writers? Sam, I'll have you go first.
Advice. That's a good one. I feel like a lot of people say this, and I think it is true. And I think Amy kind of touched on it too. Is you got to read what you want to write too. Like, if you want to write kids' books, you really do have to know what kids' books are like now. Like we were talking about earlier, the children's publishing landscape has changed so much in the last 10 years. If your only point of reference is Percy Jackson, which I mean, I love Percy Jackson, so that's like no disrespect to that. But the way Percy Jackson was written, and what we're looking for in middle grade now is different. So you really do have to kind of keep on top of what's going on right now and figure out, what's working, what's not working. And it doesn't mean that your book is still gonna, hit the #1 spot or anything like that, but at least if you're able to figure out what it is that's making these books so popular and that kids are drawn towards them, then it's going to help you in your writing. And it's going to give you that authentic feel and that voice that we're looking for when we look at kids' books. I think that's like the most obvious piece of advice you could give someone, but definitely reading in your preferred category, just so you know what's out there and how you can fit in there as well.
Amy, I'll kick to you. What advice would you give?
Yeah, similar to Sam's, you need to read in your area, and kind of, I've heard people say, if you're going to start working in a particular, in a new area of writing, you go and you read 100 things, 100 books at least that have been published in that category in the last 5 years. Like, people tend to want to write things that they liked when they were children. They want to write Winnie the Pooh. Well, no. you want to, Winnie the Pooh's not even in the right format for contemporary contemporary categories. I think working on your craft, especially if you're working in small format. Picture books are the hardest format, in my opinion. And that's often a format that people try to start with. Well, that's the hardest thing. You're working in miniature. It's like writing sonnet. So it takes a lot of work, and you have to revise and think about it. And you think it's done, you put it in a drawer, you come back to it a month later, you come back to it 6 months later, you look at it again. You need to really work on your craft. And I think that writers groups are great. Like having critique groups are really great for professional development for writers. And there's lots of like professional associations for writers out there that are very worth your time, as well as use your library card.
Okay, Khary, and for you, what advice would you give a prospective writer?
You've all touched on what a lot of the advice I would give. Like when I'm meeting with authors, especially people who are new to writing children's books, reading, very important, sort of having an understanding of category and genre. And then the other thing you just touched on, Amy, was definitely find community. So find like those writing groups that you mentioned, or other associations like Canscape or other organizations that host different venues where you're able to get feedback on your writing, or even just like having a writing partner or other folks who you trust, so like who also are invested in you and your work to critique your work. Just having another set of eyes. I know it's probably best to be surrounded by other writers who you trust their opinion, but also just having someone else read your work can do a lot and make you see things that you would not have seen. I mean, I guess it's pretty obvious to the writing classes who are present, but even outside of when you're done with writing school, when you're done with these classes, like having a community of writers will be really helpful.
Yeah, I think amazing advice across the board. Okay, so I think we're ready for our Q&A now. There's
Yeah, I'm monitoring the chat, and I think Tanya's typing in a question. I have one already that came to me directly from Caitlin. Caitlin's wondering if Amy can say a bit more about format. What did you mean when you said that Winnie the Pooh's format wasn't correct anymore? Can you clarify that?
Well, Winnie the Pooh is not really, it's sort of, they're sort of used as chapter books, but they're not really a contemporary chapter book format. So you need to know, like, there's like the basic categories would be board book, picture book, chapter book. So chapter books are for people who are new. I am serious about that 100 books thing. Yeah. And I represent a very successful picture book writer who read every picture book in the library when her children were small before she ever wrote a picture book. Well, oh yeah, so board book, picture book, chapter book, middle grade novel, young adult novel. And then there's nonfiction in all those categories, except board book is kind of fiction, nonfiction is all kind of the same for board book. But that there's some books are concerned with leveling the writing for the child reader, and some are not. So like picture books are less concerned about that because it's an adult reading to a child. Board books, again, they're designed for like 0 to 3. So there's like pictures, there's general like simple concepts often. Chapter books are for children learning to read, who are like usually like grade 2 kind of level. And then there's early readers, like read it yourself books that are sort of set up like picture books, but they're a small trim size, and they have only a certain number of words on the page. So those are the things that I'm talking about with format. So you need to look at you need to research. If you're looking to get into writing books for children, you need to know what you want to write and know what the parameters of that category are, because there's a lot of parameters that you need to be working within.
Thank you. Brooke, do you just want me to, should I just kind of go through the questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and I'll try to.
One stuck out to me. Someone was asking,
yeah.
how many clients does an agent usually represent, and do children's agents prefer one genre or another? So picture book, middle grade, fiction. I think they mean like age categories.
Usually you need to have at least 40 clients to make a living. Genre is personal preference. I do everything, but levels and genres. And I love children's nonfiction. I mean, like, I love books where you learn things, but they still have to be presented in a fun way. Yeah, that's personal preference. It's harder to find an agent when you're a picture book writer, because like if that's your format, because there's so many picture book texts in the world, and they're tricky to place. Publishers vastly prefer author illustrators if they can get author illustrators to do picture books. So it's easier to find an agent, therefore, as an author illustrator than someone who's just writing picture book text.
Yeah, I just saw another good one. So Khary and Amy, can you give us your manuscript wish list? What are you looking for right now? What are you excited to find in middle grade? Amy, you first, and then Khary.
I wanted Khary to go first. That's okay.
Khary,
yes, for sure. Manuscript wish list for middle grade specifically, or just generally? Middle grade specifically.
Middle grade specifically, and then if you have some others, share.
Right. I mean, kind of what we were just mentioning. So I'm definitely looking for in a lot of the work that I look at, I'm often looking for, yeah, an authentic voice. I'm generally um, looking to promote marginalized writers, like BIPOC folks, queer and trans writers, disabled folks, you know, the list. And so I'm often looking for that. But beyond that, humor is very important to me, that I'm very into. I know it's kind of difficult to place a like novels in verse, and it's especially in Canada. But I'm kind of, my dream is to find like the one that will do it. Kind of like other words for home, something like that. I really like that book. So I'm looking for something along those lines. Um, but also looking for middle grade nonfiction as well, which is really important. And I'm always trying to find things that combine art and science in some way that is interesting. That's like, yeah, like middle grade nonfiction, especially like science, is pretty important to ENIC. And I'm interested in science as well, but also very interested in art. So finding something that addresses both those things and makes science accessible through the arts is something that I have my eye out for these days.
Amy, did you want to share yours?
Sure. I also love middle grade nonfiction. Like nonfiction is sort of a special. I mean, I know I said all that stuff about the didacticism, but like I love information books. I love children's science books. So I'm always looking for cool middle grade nonfiction. In fiction, I am looking for mostly contemporary. Historical is something I'm finding very hard to place, so I'm not really looking for historical middle grade right now. I think that there is a hole in the market for um, books with non-binary, middle grade with non-binary and bi characters. I think that there's a lot of kids who come out in middle school now, or even like just you know, like in grade 6. Like I think and that's not being reflected, like that sort of experience is not being reflected in middle grade. And that's something that I think is that I would love to find. So I like contemporary and like sort of light fantasy. I'm not really a high fantasy person. So yeah, I'm always looking for diverse voices. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of like different like racial diversity that we haven't that exists in our country that we haven't seen in our book. You know, like one of my kids, her best friend is Jewish and Jamaican. I would love to see a middle grade novel by a Jewish Jamaican or Jewish Caribbean author. That's a wish. Yeah, I think that's specific enough.
Sam, and I think this actually might be an interesting question to answer from a marketing and publicity standpoint, because certain books get more marketing and publicity than others. Is there anything that like lights up your eyes or that you guys are looking for when you're like, oh, we're gonna market the heck out of this book?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's hard to say. I mean, I always love, you know, the more diverse stories, of course, like we were talking about, just because I never really saw myself in books growing up. So it's nice to now have that opportunity to see all that different representation and know that there are kids who can see themselves in picture books and middle grade all the way up to YA now. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there, while Amy and Khary were talking, I was trying to think like if I was looking for that dream book, what would it be? And I don't really know. Yeah, I feel like diverse fantasies work really, really well. And I think that, like, I was never really a big fantasy fan of YA, just because they all kind of felt the same. And then in the last 5 years, they've been so much more interesting, and they pull from all different mythologies and backgrounds and stuff like that. And I think it's just really cool to see and really exciting. And those seem to do really well just in general. So I mean, I basically can't speak at a publishing panel without talking about Iron Widow, which was a book that I worked on last year, because it did really, really well. And it just sort of exploded in a way that we weren't expecting. And I think it's exactly for that reason. It was a young author. It was a debut BIPOC fantasy rooted in Chinese history and culture and mythology. And it just kind of blew everybody away. And that's exactly the type of book that I think works in the market. So it's really nice to see those kinds of ones shine. And I think there's always going to be a place for them, no matter how the landscape changes in the next few years.
Yeah, very cool. I think we're running out of time, but I'll try to get a couple more questions in. I think this one is for Khary and Amy. Are you more likely to find a book through online submissions or a physical meeting, hard copy? So I guess like if, conferences.
If someone submitted something. Oh, I see what you mean. I mean, considering so much of basically my whole publishing experience has been online, essentially, like I can kind of count on two hands the number of times I've actually physically been to ENIC headquarters. A lot of my life is working remotely, and so yeah, most of the time I'll find things through a submission inbox, or I'll be in contact with writers by email, and typically we'll have a Zoom meeting or Google Meets meeting or something like that. So very rarely have I met someone in person and have had that kind. I mean, it's unfortunate because I actually really do prefer engaging people in person, but just given the nature of how things are now, yeah, generally it's been online.
I'd say both. I mean, probably more online just because there's more done online. I have taken on clients that I initially met at conferences. One of my best surprises of like new clients came through Fold, Festival of Literary Diversity, the Fold manuscript evaluations, and it was one of my colleagues who got the submission when she was evaluating manuscripts for the adult part of that program, and said, I don't think this is an adult book. So things like that, like manuscript evaluations through festivals, especially festivals without a lot of barriers, like Fold, those are very useful. I get honestly a lot of find clients often through my current clients, like, people will meet a client at something, a new writer will meet one of my clients somewhere and talk to them, and then or become acquainted with them, and then they connect me because they like the writing or something like that.
Are we out of time? Okay, so regardless, there's a lot more questions, but unfortunately it looks like we're out of time, so we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to put the link in the chat one more time for our other events that are coming up this fall. And yeah, I just want to give a big round of thanks to our panel. If people want to unmute and just clap or whatever you want to do, that's great. And thanks for hosting.
Give a round of applause. Thank you, everybody.